that mental health, mental wellness, if you want to use a different word. Mental health, a lot of people have a stigma. What happens when we feel overwhelmed by chronic stress? We slip into things like, that's great if you can, but I actually have designed a chart, kind of a tracking chart for myself and say, okay, make sure, Ron, that you're kind of hitting these 7 categories on a weekly basis for sure. And I've had some assignments on this, so I'm not going to go really into, don't skimp on your sleep. And all kinds of research to say that when you're low on sleep, it's like you're impaired, right? It's like, let's move to this one. You say, wait a minute, we're talking about the brain. Why are we talking about physical time? And get outside, walk. I'm not a big fan of treadmills, by the way. Get outside, all right? So get outside, just do some walking if you need to. Go to whatever level you need to or you want to, but get some movement. So when we feel a lack of stimulation, we're gonna feel boredom, or overstimulation, which is probably more prevalent right now in modern society than a lack of stimulation. Many people don't like that feeling of being bored. That's a stressor. So what do? We overschedule ourselves and we overstimulate ourselves with what, 24-hour news cycles, social media. We're serious business people, leaders in our communities, and all those good things that we're doing. But at the end of the day, we need to factor in some things that we used to do when we were children, right? And so find time. Again, I'm an introvert. And so find time. Again, I'm an introvert, so it's hard for me to cultivate this, and I'm working on it. And downtime is not necessarily leisure time, all right? So this means go lay in the park, right? I would like to say go. We're addicted to busyness, and I'm going to say B-U-S-Y, busyness. We feel like we're not doing our job, or we're falling behind, or whatever that inner dialogue sounds like for you. But what I'm saying is, I'll actually build in downtime / boredom time. I'll spend time, even if it's just 5 minutes at a time where I do nothing. I'm not listening to music. I'm not. Let them remember what it feels like to be bored. And time in. The wise people. So understanding when to kind of just tune in, have some time in where you're saying, okay, take care of your mental health, your mental wellness, and also hopefully, those around you, right? And again, hopefully you're moving that up to. So that's what we're going to focus on. And this be thinking, maybe I'm thinking doom and gloom before I have to do a presentation. So it's going to be a physiological changes. If I feel my hands sweating, that can actually trigger a psychological response to be fearful or to feel anxiety just because my hands are sweating, right? So one of the big drivers of our conversation around arousal. So when you feel anxiety, when you feel nervous, when you even feel fear, to a certain And really what I want you to take away from this is as arousal goes up, and again, arousal can be anxiety, it can be stress, it can be fear, it can be anger, it can be excitement. Those are all forms of arousal. So as arousal goes up, so does performance, all right? So when you feel anxiety, when you feel nervous, when you even feel fear to a certain level, that's a good thing. We don't want to go away from that. We want that arousal. What I want you to take away from this idea, from this slide, is performance goes up with arousal up to a certain point. We have that optimal arousal, that sweet spot that we often talk. It doesn't truly happen that way for many things in life. That's a nice curve. It illustrates the point. It's a little bit more messy than that in real life. And the other thing to think about is with a simple task, it's going to behave a little bit differently as opposed to a difficult task. So as you can see, it's going to drop off for a difficult task. But the other thing that we'll talk about a little bit later is the idea of the window of tolerance. And so I'm showing you a chart. The person that created this chart, their reference is at the bottom. I don't want to steal this from them, but I am using this and giving them proper credit. But the polyvagal chart looks a lot like that Yerkes-Dodson curve, right? So I think this is quite fascinating to kind of look at this. It's talking about things like, familiar terms like parasympathetic nervous. Let's talk about this idea of what happens when let's say we are, it's violently moving. It's something that is getting my attention. The low road, and this slide comes from Dr. Joseph Ledoux. It's violently moving. It's something that is getting my attention. I see these bushes moving. Now, I'm going to use, we can obviously sense that with all of our senses, but one of the most powerful senses is vision. So I see that, all right? So let's just use that as our example. I have that input, that stimulus that's coming into the brain. It goes in through the brain, comes through my eyes, and then splits off. It takes a high road and a low road, all right? So that signal comes in, and it splits off through the high road and the low road. The low road, and this slide comes from Dr. Joseph Ledoux. It's the low road is going to be the thalamus amygdala circuit. So it's going to the thalamus and the amygdala. Remember, the amygdala is fight or flight. It goes there really fast. About 12 milliseconds, that signal will get to the amygdala, all right? It's often wrong, all right? We see the bush is moving. It's going to assume that's a grizzly bear that's about to have me for lunch. All right, now it could be a grizzly bear. As far as the amygdala is concerned, it's going to err on the side of caution and say, yep, that's a grizzly bear. We need to do something. We need to either get ready to fight or we need to run away. All right, so that's amygdala's job, to keep us alive long enough to reproduce. Remember that, all right? So that's the low road. But notice the difference here is it goes on the high road about 3 times slower. All right, so it goes to the amygdala, if you remember, in 12 milliseconds, incredibly fast. It's about a tenth of a second to kind of give you an idea. About a third of a second, or maybe even longer, it takes to go to the prefrontal cortex, all right? Does that seem like a faulty system? Why would it go to the amygdala faster than the prefrontal cortex? Well, the reason is we want to stay alive, all right? Logic and reason is probably not the most important thing right now, all right? The most important thing is to keep ourselves alive. If that's a grizzly bear, if that's a predator, it will shut down the communication to the prefrontal cortex. So again, that's real. That's happening. Let's demystify this idea. All it is an overwhelming response, usually out of proportion. But our brain will be tricked into the idea of thinking, try to keep it online. And there's a lot of little tricks. What happens when we have a strong stress response? Again, I should be more clear. When we feel distress, right? And again, that strong stress response is often, not always, but often it's going to be revolving around fear. So let's just use that as our example. So the amygdala is going to basically, as you know, it's going to be a big player in this response. And so it's going to fire off electrical impulses to other parts of the brain and really to the brainstem. And it's really just mobilizing the parts of the brain that it thinks it needs for fight or flight. So it's going to fire off all these signals very quickly. All right, it's very metabolically draining. Right, and so this idea, I think I mentioned earlier in one of the previous videos that adrenaline, when we feel fear, adrenaline's going to spike. So it's going to mobilize us. But that adrenaline. It's going to mobilize us, but that adrenaline can be very draining. And I would also say that adrenaline is something that's going to happen. It's immediate, it's a quick response, but it's going to be a much shorter response. And you can think of that as seconds and minutes, that kind of a time frame. So if you can imagine now, if we have something that the fear lasts an extended period of time. Then we're gonna and so one of the things that happens when you're very highly aroused, highly stressed, is what's happening is you have a mixture. But again, one of the things that the other thing I want you to take away from all this is when we have something, there's nothing crazy about that. All I would say to you is we want to try to back that down. All right, so that's too high. That's too much arousal. All right, we want to back that arousal down so we can get into the sweet spot again. But a lot of times, just with practice, we can get there. All right, and so understand that. Understand it's normal. But again, one of the things the other thing I want you to take away from all this is when we have something, let's say you've had a near-death experience, let's go really, high level stuff here. You're usually not going to have a near-death experience giving a presentation, but if you had something where you almost died in a car accident, perhaps, you're going to feel like you have a hangover for quite a long time after that, right? Maybe you've experienced that. I've experienced some times in my life where 4 hours later, I felt like I was still very depleted. That is the cortisol that's been flooded through your system that really has kind of wreaked havoc on your system. One of the things I would add to this, and I borrow this, I don't remember who I learned this from, but it's not original to me, but I really like this analogy. We are not designed for chronic stress. What we're designed for is transient, moderate stress, right? If you've had other courses with me, you've probably heard me say this, transient, moderate stress. So think of like a sine wave, right? So transient means it comes and goes with time, right? So transient goes up, we have stress, and then we rest, and then we stress, and then we rest, all right? So that's turning it on, turning it off, turning it on, turning it on. So again, transient, moderate stress is actually what we're designed for. Our brain actually likes that challenge. So don't be afraid of transient, moderate stress. In fact, I would welcome it into your life to grow and improve. This is a good mechanism for that. Now, chronic stress is when we have the stress that comes up and it plateaus, right? Many of us in our modern society are over little things happening throughout our lives that keep that stress level at all right. If you redline your engine for too long, it will blow. All right. We call that burnout. I don't remember what your name was, but it was one of the mini books I've read. And I think it was, that's what we're designed for. All right. So that's that transient moderate stress. And you might say, hey, Ron, that's not moderate stress. That might be more than moderate. But you get the idea, right? It's a stress that's come and it's gone. All right. Now we can get back to normal. That's what we're designed for. And that's why our brain is well designed for that. But in modern, we want to hit that brake pedal from time to time. He's climbing without ropes. And I'm just watching that. It's like, okay, that doesn't overwhelm me. It might at the beginning. Again, we're built for transient moderate stress. And so many more things come into play when we can move that level.
Our nervous system is functionally a triangle upside down, okay, with a point. This is the brainstem. I'm talking about the circuits that are being regulated in the brainstem that regulate our underlying state, percolate information up to the brainstem, and the brainstem, it literally is transmitting that information to
And I believe that for leadership of ourselves and personal excellence, as Dr. Stephen Porges kind of laid it out, it consists of three things: the ventral vagal complex. Number one, as I think at this point you should be aware that as arousal goes up, a lot of times it's going to. But what I think is interesting here is we go into fight or flight mode. If when I feel so overwhelmed, I'll just put my head in the sand and hope it all goes away, right? So maybe it's no longer fight or flight. It's I give up. We're waving the white flag and saying. And so when we're in that mode, we've certainly tamped down the nervous system reactions. Now, of course, as we've said already, we'll say it again. So what I would say is use this, this idea. You can, develop that mindset that you can deal with that.
My good friend Vince is a director of maintenance at a summer camp. One year they were building a beach, so he hired a backhoe. While they were digging,
Some of us learn these or gravitate toward these easier than others, but all of them can be learned and developed. One only thing I would push back on significant adversity, we can have resilience too, things that are not significant. Maybe they're little things that are happening in life. So maybe I would pull out the word significant. That's where you're going to see a difference between mental toughness, which is much more proactive. So that is but a sense of control or internal locus of control, if you've heard that term. And it's just that idea that so we're bouncing back from adversity. That's another way to think of resilience. And this is a dynamic process, right? Sometimes we may feel there's a lot of factors that go into, am I feeling resilient right now? Maybe on one day I'm not. In one context, one situation, I don't feel resilient. But in another context, another situation, I do. So understand it's moving around. And we can, much like mental toughness, if you don't use it, you lose it. All right? So practice resilience. Think with a resilient mindset. Much of this is going to be driven by mindset. Controllability, let's talk about this really quick as it relates to resilience. If we can look at aversive events, one of the worst situations is when we feel we don't have control in our lives, right? That's going to drive, it's an accumulation of life events that maybe are undesirable or at least perceived as undesirable or uncontrollable. And key brain regions that are kind of involved with resilience. The prefrontal cortex is going to play a crucial role when we talk about resilience. So studies have shown that individuals with greater prefrontal cortex activity and connectivity are better, they can cope with stress and adversity better. Again, remember with resilience, I apologize for totally botching that, but the HP axis, we'll just call it that so your professor doesn't choke on those words. But this can help. The other part of neuroscience that we see here is in the next video, we're going to talk about perseverance, and then we'll